In 1901, a boarding house landlady in Pittsburgh fed 14 steel workers breakfast every single morning for $1.10 a week each. She woke at 4. By 6, the long table groaned with food, and those men ate like kings on wages that barely covered rent. Most people think working men in old America went hungry. The truth is stranger. Number 8 on this list cost pennies, but sat on the table like a feast. Number 3 fed the men who built the railroads. And number 12 is being sold in trendy cafes right now for $11 a plate. These breakfasts were engineered for one thing: sending a man to 12 hours of brutal labor. Hit that subscribe button and let us count down the 25 forgotten boarding house breakfasts that fed working men for pennies. Number 25, cornmeal mush and milk. This was the meal that said the landlady had a full house and thin margins, and everyone was still going to leave the table warm. She stirred yellow cornmeal into salted boiling water the night before, cooking it low until it thickened into a smooth, heavy porridge. Come morning, she spooned it steaming into bowls and poured cold milk over the top, sometimes with a drizzle of molasses if the week had been kind. A pound of cornmeal cost about 2 cents and fed a table of 10. The men ate it fast because the whistle did not wait. It sat heavy in the stomach and burned slow, exactly what a man needed before 8 hours of shoveling coal or lifting steel. It was the floor beneath every working man's morning, the meal that guaranteed no one walked out the door empty. Number 24, stewed prunes. To a modern American, prunes are a punchline. To a boarding house full of laboring men in 1910, they were medicine, dessert, and luxury all at once. Dried plums cost almost nothing by the pound, which is why the landlady kept a crock of them soaking on the back of the stove. She simmered them slow with a little sugar until they plumped up dark and glossy in a thick, sweet syrup. Served in a small dish beside the eggs, they were the only sweetness some men tasted all day. But there was a practical reason, too. Men eating a diet of salt pork, bread, and coffee needed the fruit to keep their bodies running, and the landladies knew it without ever reading a nutrition chart. A bowl of stewed prunes was the quiet thing that kept a crew of hard men healthy enough to keep working. Number 23, milk toast. When a boarder came down sick or came home the night before having spent his pay unwisely, the landlady made milk toast. Slices of day-old bread were toasted golden, laid in a bowl, and drowned in hot milk, salted and thickened with a little butter. The toast went soft and custardy at the bottom, while the edges held just enough bite to remind you it was bread. It cost almost nothing, but it was the meal that told a man someone in that house was looking after him. Boarding house life could be lonely, a rented bed in a strange city far from family. Milk toast was the closest thing to being cared for that many of those men would feel for months at a time. Number 22, salt mackerel. Before refrigeration reached working neighborhoods, fish arrived packed in barrels of salt, and salt mackerel was the cheapest of them all. The landlady pulled a couple of fillets from the brine the night before and soaked them in cold water to draw out the fierce saltiness. In the morning, she laid them in a hot skillet slicked with drippings until the skin crisped and the flesh flaked apart. Served with boiled potatoes or a slab of bread to catch the oil, salt mackerel was a Friday fixture in Catholic boarding houses across the industrial East, where half the men would not touch meat on a Friday. A barrel of the stuff cost a few dollars and lasted for weeks. It filled the kitchen with a smell that either turned your stomach or made you homesick for the coast, depending entirely on where you came from. Number 21. Graham gems. That heavy cast iron gem pan with its little cups shaped like half moons was the secret behind the fastest hot bread a landlady could put on the table. She mixed graham flour, the coarse whole wheat kind milled the old way, with milk, an egg, and a little molasses, then spooned it into the smoking, hot, greased pan and shoved it into the oven. In 15 minutes, the gems came out dark and crackling on the outside, tender in the middle, ready to be split and buttered while the men shuffled to their seats. Graham flour cost less than white and filled a man up faster, which is why boarding houses leaned on it. The gems needed no yeast, no rising time, no skill beyond a hot pan and a steady hand. They were the answer to a house full of hungry men, and only 20 minutes to feed them. Modern bakeries have rediscovered whole grain muffins and charge a fortune for them. The gem pan did it first for pennies. Number 20. Fried apples. In the fall, when the orchards came in and apples were the cheapest food in America, the landlady turned them into a breakfast that felt like a treat and cost almost nothing. She sliced them thick, skins on for body, and dropped them into a skillet with bacon grease and a heavy dusting of brown sugar and cinnamon. Over a low flame, they cooked down until the edges caramelized and the whole panful turned soft and syrupy and fragrant enough to pull a man out of bed. Served alongside sausage or piled onto a biscuit, fried apples cut through the heaviness of a working man's breakfast with something bright and sweet. A bushel of windfall apples cost a landlady next to nothing, and she could stretch it across a week of mornings. The men who grew up on farms tasted their mother's kitchens in every bite, the flavor of home served in a rented dining room. Number 19. Oatmeal with molasses. Long before oatmeal became a health food with a cartoon Quaker on the box, it was the fuel that got Scottish and Irish laborers through a shift underground. The landlady simmered steel-cut oats slow until they turned thick and creamy, then stirred in a dark ribbon of blackstrap molasses that gave the bowl an almost bittersweet depth. A pinch of salt, a splash of milk, and that was breakfast. A pound of oats cost a few cents and swelled to feed the whole table. What the men did not know, and what nutritionists confirmed decades later, was that slow oats and mineral-rich molasses delivered iron and steady energy that burned for hours instead of spiking and crashing. The landladies were not chemists. They just knew that a man who ate oatmeal did not come dragging back to the table at 10 in the morning, begging for more. First pattern break. Here is where the story gets bigger than the food. The boarding house was one of the most important institutions in American history, and almost nobody talks about it anymore. In the great industrial cities between 1870 and 1930, millions of men, immigrants fresh off the boat, farm boys chasing factory wages, single men following the work, lived in rented rooms and ate at a common table run by a woman who became, for many, the closest thing to family they had. She was the landlady, and she ran that house like a ship, waking before dawn to haul the coal, boil the coffee, and cook for a dozen men on a food budget that would make a modern chef weep. The phrase, boarding house reach, reaching clear across the table for the last biscuit before someone else got it, comes from this world. These were tables where you ate fast or you ate nothing, and the woman who set them fed the men who built America. Number 18. Codfish cakes. Salt cod was the protein that fed the working coasts of America, dried hard as a board and cheap enough that no boarding house was ever without it. The landlady soaked a piece overnight to pull the salt, then flaked it and mashed it with boiled potato, a beaten egg, and a little onion. She fried the patties in hot fat until they turned deep golden and crackling outside, soft and savory within. 2 fish cakes with a spoon of stewed tomatoes made a breakfast that stuck to a man through a morning of hard labor. A pound of salt cod cost a fraction of fresh meat and kept for months, which is why New England boarding houses served these so often the men grew tired of them. Today, a plate of cod cakes at a coastal restaurant will run you $15 and get called artisanal. The landlady called it Thursday. Number 17, fried potatoes and onions. Every boarding house kitchen ran on a bag of potatoes and a can of saved grease, and the two came together most mornings in a skillet the size of a wagon wheel. The landlady sliced cold-boiled potatoes left from last night's supper and laid them into hot bacon fat with a heap of sliced onion. Then let them go low and slow so the bottoms crisped into a golden crust before she turned them. The onions caramelized into sweet, soft ribbons woven through the potatoes. Salt, pepper, and nothing else. A 50-pound sack of potatoes cost under $1 and fed a house for a week, and the grease was free, saved in a can on the back of the stove. This was the meal that used up yesterday, so nothing was wasted, and it filled a plate for almost no money at all. The men who ate it never once thought of it as a side dish. It was supper's leftovers made into breakfast itself. Number 16, egg gravy. When eggs were too dear to fry one per man, the clever landlady turned 2 eggs into breakfast for the whole table with a trick called egg gravy. She melted a spoon of fat, whisked in flour, then poured in milk and stirred until it thickened into a smooth white gravy. Right at the end, she beat 2 eggs and stirred them straight into the simmering pot, where they set into tender golden threads throughout. Ladled thick over toast or split biscuits, egg gravy gave a man the taste of eggs without the cost of an egg apiece. This was the arithmetic that ran every boarding house in the country, the quiet math of turning almost nothing into enough. The men soaking their biscuits never knew they were eating a landlady's clever budget. They just knew they left full. Number 15, dried apple pie for breakfast. Here is a fact that stops modern Americans cold. PIE was a breakfast food. In the boarding houses of New England and the rural North, a wedge of pie in the morning was not indulgence, it was fuel, and the cheapest pie of all was dried apple. The landlady soaked dried apple rings until they swelled soft, cooked them down with sugar and cinnamon, and sealed them in a lard crust the evening before. In the morning, a cold slice went on the plate beside the eggs and coffee. No apology offered or expected. A working man burning 6,000 calories a day needed the sugar and the fat, and pie delivered both in a form that traveled to the job in a coat pocket. Dried apples cost pennies and lasted all winter after the fresh fruit was gone. The idea of pie for breakfast survives now only in old jokes and older cookbooks, but it built railroads and framed houses, one cold slice at a time. Number 14, hominy grits. Below the Mason-Dixon line, no boarding house breakfast was complete without a pot of grits. Dried hominy, corn treated with lye to swell and soften, was ground coarse and simmered slow in salted water until it turned into a thick, creamy, pale porridge. The landlady set the pot in the middle of the table and let the men doctor it themselves, some with melting butter, some with a spoon of red-eye gravy, some with nothing but salt. A bag of grits swelled to 3 times its size in the pot, feeding a full house on a handful of cents. What the men did not realize was that the lye treatment, an old indigenous technique, unlocked nutrients in the corn that plain cornmeal never delivered. The landladies inherited that wisdom without knowing its science. Grits kept mill workers and dock hands fed across the entire South. Number 13. Scrapple. When the landlady in a Pennsylvania Dutch boarding house got a good price on a hog, nothing went to waste, and scrapple was the proof. The trimmings and scraps, too humble for the supper table, were simmered until the meat fell apart, then thickened with cornmeal and buckwheat flour and seasoned hard with sage, pepper, and thyme. She poured the mixture into loaf pans and let it set firm overnight in the cold pantry. Come morning, she sliced the loaf a quarter-inch thick and fried the slices in a hot skillet until each side turned deep mahogany and crisp as glass, while the inside stayed soft and savory. Served with fried eggs and a drizzle of molasses or apple butter, scrapple launched working men into the fields and factories of the Delaware Valley for 100 years. A loaf cost almost nothing to make and fed the whole house for days. It was thrift you could taste, the whole animal honored on a breakfast plate. Second pattern break. Here is something the modern food world does not want you to sit with too long. Every meal on this list was built on a principle we have abandoned. Nothing was wasted. The bone from Sunday's ham-flavored Monday's gravy. Last night's boiled potatoes became this morning's hash. The scraps of the hog became scrapple. The stale bread became milk toast. The tough salt cod became crackling fish cakes. A boarding house landlady fed 12 grown working men on a food budget of a few dollars a week, and she did it by treating every scrap as something precious, because to her it was. There was no garbage can in that kitchen, only a stock pot, a grease can, and a plan for tomorrow. We now throw away nearly a third of the food we buy and spend more on it than any generation in history. That landlady would not have understood us. She fed a nation on what we scrape into the bin. Number 12, fried mush. Remember the cornmeal mush from number 25. Here is what the landlady did with what the men did not finish. She pressed the leftover mush into a loaf pan and set it in the cold pantry overnight, where it firmed up solid. In the morning, she turned it out, sliced it thick, and laid the slices into a screaming hot skillet of grease until each side formed a crackling golden crust, while the inside stayed soft and creamy. Served with butter and molasses or a pour of dark syrup, fried mush was a transformation. The same cheap cornmeal from the day before turned into something that ate like a treat. It cost the landlady nothing but the grease because the mush was already made. And here is the part that stings. That exact dish, sliced fried polenta, now appears on brunch menus in fashionable American cities for $11 a plate. The landladies were serving it to steelworkers for free a century ago. Number 11, creamed chipped beef on toast. The military gave this dish a name too crude to print here, but boarding house men just called it a good breakfast. Dried beef, sliced paper thin and heavily salted, came cheap in small glass jars and kept forever. The landlady tore it into strips and stirred it into a thick white gravy of butter, flour, and milk, letting the salt from the beef season the whole pot for free. Poured steaming over toast, it turned 2 ounces of preserved meat into a hot, rich, filling breakfast for the whole table. The toast soft beneath the gravy, the beef giving it a deep, almost smoky bite. A jar of chipped beef cost a fraction of fresh meat and stretched impossibly far in that gravy. Generations of American working men ate this to start their day, and generations more ate it in Army mess halls. Cheap, fast, and filling, it did everything a boarding house breakfast was meant to. Number 10, Johnny cakes. Older than the country itself, the Johnny cake was the working man's pancake before wheat flour was cheap enough to waste on breakfast. The landlady stirred cornmeal with salt and boiling water into a thick batter, then dropped spoonfuls onto a greased griddle until the edges laced crisp and golden and the centers stayed tender. The cakes came off in stacks, ready to be split and buttered and drowned in molasses or sorghum syrup. Cornmeal cost half what wheat flour did, which is why the poorer boarding houses leaned on Johnny cakes when the flour barrel ran low. The name itself is Old American shorthand, a corruption of journey cake because these traveled cold in a pocket to the job. The men who ate them were tasting a recipe passed down from the first colonists, unchanged for 200 years. Number 9. Donuts. When a boarding house landlady wanted to be beloved, she made donuts, and word spread through the house before the first one hit the plate. These were not the fancy glazed rings of a modern bakery. They were fried cakes, simple rounds of sweetened dough dropped into a kettle of hot lard until they puffed golden and crisp, then rolled in sugar while still warm. Making them took time and fat, so they appeared on good mornings, payday mornings, holiday mornings, the mornings the landlady wanted to send her men off happy. The kitchen filled with the smell of frying dough, and the men came down early just to be near it. A batch cost only flour, sugar, and lard, all pantry staples, yet nothing on the breakfast table generated more gratitude. A donut and a cup of coffee at dawn told a working man that this rented house, for all its hardness, held a little kindness too. Number 8. Boarding house beefsteak and fried eggs. Now here is where a poor man's breakfast started to feel like wealth. Prime steak was for restaurants and rich men, but the landlady bought the cheap cuts, round steak and chuck, the tough ones that cost a fraction of the price. She pounded them thin with the edge of a heavy plate, dredged them in seasoned flour, and fried them fast and hard in a smoking skillet until a brown crust formed. Then she cracked eggs into the same pan to catch every bit of the beef flavor left behind. A slab of that cheap steak with 2 fried eggs and a heap of fried potatoes was the breakfast that made a laboring man feel like a king for 20 cents. The pounding was the whole secret, the trick that turned shoe leather into something a tired man could actually chew. It looked like a splurge. It ate like a splurge. But the landlady knew exactly how little it truly cost her, and she never told. Third pattern break. Here is what the history books leave out. The men eating these breakfasts were the loneliest people in America. Think about who filled those boarding houses. A young Italian who spoke no English, 3 years from his mother's table. A Polish miner sending every spare dollar home to a wife he had not seen in 2 years. A farm boy from Ohio, 17, sleeping 4 to a room in a city that did not know his name. For these men, the boarding house breakfast was not just fuel. It was the one warm, human moment in a day of grinding, anonymous labor. And presiding over it all was the coffee, always the coffee, boiled thick and black in a battered pot on the back of the stove, poured endlessly, the one thing no landlady ever ran short of. A working man might skip the meat. He never skipped the coffee. It was medicine, ritual, and comfort in a single tin cup, the thing that told him he was not entirely alone. Number 7. Ham and red-eye gravy. In the southern boarding house, a slab of country ham was worth its weight in wages, and the landlady wasted not one drop of what it gave her. She fried thick slices of the salty cured ham until the edges curled and browned, then lifted them out and poured a cup of hot black coffee straight into the sizzling pan. The coffee lifted every caramelized bit stuck to the bottom, reducing into a thin, dark, glistening gravy with a name that matched its color, red eye. Spooned over the ham, over grits, over a split biscuit, that gravy carried the deep, salty richness of the whole ham into every bite. It cost the landlady nothing beyond a little coffee poured into a dirty pan. The bitterness cut clean through the fatty salt of the pork, and the men mopped their plates until they shone. It was the taste of the South in a single, glistening spoonful. Number 6. Corned beef hash. Monday morning began with Sunday's leftovers, and no leftover was more welcome than the corned beef. The landlady chopped the cold-boiled meat fine, mixed it with diced boiled potato and a little onion, then pressed it flat into a hot greased skillet and left it alone. That was the trick. She let it sit until a deep brown crust formed before she folded it over on itself, so every plate got some crisp and some soft. When she stirred in a few cut-up beets, the whole panful turned rosy pink, and the men called it red flannel hash. A poached or fried egg went on top, its yolk breaking golden across the crust. This was the meal that turned the tail end of one dinner into a whole new breakfast, stretching a single cut of meat across 2 days and a dozen men. Number 5. Sausage patties and milk gravy. When the hog was fresh, the landlady ground the trimmings with sage and pepper into loose sausage, shaped it into patties, and fried them until the fat rendered and the edges went crackling brown. But the sausage was only half the gift. Into that skillet full of drippings, she whisked a spoon of flour, then poured milk slow until it thickened into a thick, peppery, cream-colored gravy flecked with browned pork. 2 small patties and a flood of that gravy over split biscuits carried a man clear to the noon whistle without a single hunger pang. The gravy was the multiplier, the way a little sausage fed a lot of men. Pork was cheap when the hog came in, and the landlady stretched every scrap across the coming weeks. That plate of sausage and gravy became the signature of the American working man's morning, and it earned the honor. Number 4. Baked beans for breakfast. In New England, beans were not a side dish, and they were not for supper. They were breakfast, and they were sacred. The landlady soaked a pot of navy beans on Saturday, then buried them in a slow oven overnight with a chunk of salt pork, a spoon of molasses, and a little mustard, until the beans turned soft and creamy, and the whole pot took on a deep, smoky richness. Sunday morning, and cold mornings all week after, those beans came to the table steaming, served with brown bread and washed down with coffee. A pound of dried beans cost about a dime and fed the house for 2 days, delivering protein and slow-burning energy that kept a man fueled through the hardest shift. This was the meal that built the mill towns of Massachusetts and Maine, so beloved that Boston earned its nickname from it. Baked beans at breakfast strikes us as strange now. To those men, it was the taste of Sunday. Number 3. Salt pork and sawmill gravy over biscuits. This is the breakfast that fed the men who built the railroads, felled the forests, and dug the mines, and it started with the cheapest meat in America. Salt pork, a fist-sized chunk of heavily cured fatback, went into a hot skillet and fried until the fat rendered and the edges crisped. Then, into all that glistening grease, the landlady stirred a handful of cornmeal or flour, let it toast nutty brown, and poured in milk or even just water, stirring until it thickened into a speckled, savory gravy. They called it sawmill gravy because it looked, some joked, like the sawdust of the mill camps where it fed the loggers. Poured over a mountain of hot, split biscuits, it turned a few cents of preserved pork into a breakfast that sat in a man's belly like ballast. Salt pork cost around 10 cents a pound, and lasted for months without ice. That gravy over biscuits was survival made delicious, the fuel of every labor camp and boarding house on the frontier. Number 2, sour milk flapjacks. Milk that had gone sour was not thrown out, ever, and the smartest landladies knew it made the finest pancakes on earth. The natural acid in the soured milk reacted with a pinch of baking soda to lift the batter into flapjacks that came off the griddle taller, lighter, and more tender than anything sweet milk could produce. She ladled the batter onto a hot greased griddle, waited for the bubbles to break across the surface, then flipped each cake to reveal a perfect golden brown. Stacked high and buttered between the layers, then drowned in molasses or sorghum syrup, a plate of flapjacks was the breakfast that made a hard morning bearable. The whole thing cost pennies, flour, a little fat, and the sour milk that would otherwise have gone to the pig. The sound of the batter hissing on the griddle pulled the whole house downstairs. It was cheap and plentiful and filled a working man to the brim, which is exactly why the griddle was the busiest thing in the kitchen every morning. Number 1, buckwheat cakes with molasses. At the very top of this list sits the breakfast that meant more to the American working man than any other, the buckwheat cake. The landlady kept a crock of buckwheat batter going all winter, feeding it flour and water each night, and letting the wild yeast ferment it into something tangy and alive, so that every morning she could ladle straight from the crock onto the smoking griddle. The cakes came off dark, nutty, faintly sour, and gloriously heavy, stacked 3 and 4 high and buttered between each layer, then buried under a slow pour of molasses or maple syrup. Buckwheat grew on poor soil where nothing else would, which made it cheap, and it filled a laboring man in a way that lighter cakes never could, burning slow through a whole morning of brutal work. The smell of that batter hitting the griddle at dawn woke the entire house and pulled men out of cold beds toward the warm kitchen. It was more than food. It was the smell of the day beginning, the one certainty in an uncertain life, the promise that whatever the shift held, a man had eaten well before he faced it. Every boarding house had its crock, and for 100 years the stack of dark buckwheat cakes under a river of molasses was the taste of an America built by men who worked with their hands. Here's my challenge. Make one of these this week. Just one. The fried mush, the sawmill gravy, the buckwheat cakes, the baked beans. Then sit down at a real table and eat it slow. Because these breakfasts were never just about being cheap. They were about sending a man out the door fed, cared for, and ready to face a day that would have broken most of us. Drop the one you are going to try in the comments. I want to know if the sawmill gravy gets more love than the buckwheat cakes, and whether your family ever ran a boarding house or ate in one. Because these were not just breakfasts. They were the quiet fuel of a country that got built one morning, one full plate, and one hungry working man at a time.